Good morning and welcome to a live stream here from Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Ayya Vaḍḍha and I'm going to be leading the live stream today. Today we're going to be looking at another story, another discourse, this time from the Vinaya Pitaka, so not from the Sutta Pitaka as we usually do, but this time a story from the collection on the monastic code of conduct, so on the monks' rules, which is very similar though to a sutta. And so whether you're watching this live, I see some friends already joining in and leaving nice comments in the live chat, or whether you're watching this later on as a recording, I hope that you're doing well and that you're having a nice morning or a nice evening and that your practice is going smoothly. And so you can find the content for today's discussion in the description of the video. So below the video, there should be a link to the section that we're going to be looking at from the Vinaya. And this is a section of the Vinaya for those who don't know, because you might be less familiar with the Vinaya Pitaka, as it's less commonly read and discussed amongst lay disciples. This is in a section called the Mahakandaka. And it is a section detailing the biography, you could say, of the Buddha after his awakening, as he then established a community of disciples. So as the Buddha went on to teach different people the Dhamma and to establish a community of monastics, both Bhikkhus and Bhikkhunis, and to establish the Fourfold Assembly, including the lay disciples. This narrative, this Mahakandaka, is a very, very long chapter detailing a biography, almost a kind of description of a chronology, you could say, of the Buddha's journey establishing the order. So it kind of gives you a lens into a description of the first days of the Sangha, a description of what it was that the Buddha was up to, what it was that he was doing after he attained awakening. And so just saying hello to a few of the people joining in live. We have Madeline from the UK. Hello, Madeline. And Sean, good morning. Maria, Mano, Richard, Meredith, Edward, and I'm sure others also joining in. So hello to all of you. Okay, so this time I will go ahead and render homage to the Buddha, and then after that we can look at the discussion for today, the Vinaya Pitaka for today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang saranang gacchami. Okay, so today we'll be looking at the account of the going forth of Sāriputta and Moggallāna. And so for those who don't know, I think it's important to give some background. So Venerable Sāriputta was the Buddha's chief bhikkhu disciple in wisdom, in panya, right? Wisdom is a quality that you can develop which penetrates into the nature of reality, which understands how things work. And it understands how to act skillfully in difficult situations and how to avoid the mind being overcome by unskillful and harmful mental states. So wisdom is a kind of practical knowledge. It's a knowledge about the world, it's a knowledge about life, which is able to effectively uproot any unwholesome tendencies or effectively navigate difficult and challenging situations, both in our mind and in the world, as the case may be. And so Venerable Sāriputta was the Buddha's chief disciple in wisdom. And it is said that Venerable Sāriputta was able to achieve enlightenment with very, very little instruction from the Buddha. And we will see a little bit of that today in his character. So Venerable Sāriputta was, for example, famous for achieving various different levels of meditation. And he was able to analyze those levels of meditation and progress through them as he understood how to move forward, how to let go of what was more coarse and how to move to what was more subtle. And afterwards, Venerable Sāriputta was famous for teaching the Dhamma, for analyzing the Buddha's teachings and expounding it to people so that they could understand in very fine and minute detail. For example, we have a very famous discourse in the Majjhima Nikaya number 28, where Venerable Sāriputta analyzes the Four Noble Truths And from the Four Noble Truths, he then goes into talking about many more fine and subtle aspects of the Buddha's teaching, and kind of wrapping everything up into a whole package, a kind of complete package of the practice, starting with the Four Noble Truths, going into very fine and subtle details, and then circling back around to the whole topic. So Venerable Sāriputta had this kind of very analytical and very, you could say, insightful mind, right? His mind was able to see into something very simple and break it down into something much more refined and subtle. And he was able to analyze and compartmentalize all of that information in a practical way, right? In a skillful way. And so Venerable Sāriputta was very wise. And the Buddha said that any disciple of the Buddha's could at best match him in wisdom. So if you know someone wise in your life, well, no one could be wiser than Venerable Sāriputta of the disciples of the Buddha. And so Venerable Sāriputta was, in the Buddha's own eyes, he was seen as the most wise person that existed, really, after the Buddha himself. And so Venerable Sāriputta had the Buddha's faculty of wisdom. He was the heir of the Buddha's wisdom. Of course, all the Buddha's Arhat disciples were very wise, but Venerable Sāriputta had this particular quality of exceptional wisdom. And Venerable Mahamoggallāna was Venerable Sāriputta's friend. So they were friends, and they knew each other before they went forth, as we will learn in the account today. And Venerable Mahamoggallāna was the Buddha's foremost bhikkhu disciple in psychic powers, in what we call, they're called in Pali, idhis. So idhis, or in Sanskrit, sometimes called siddhis, right? They refer to the psychic powers that people can achieve. Some people can achieve them through deep meditation and through mastery of the mind. So just as, for example, a strong person who has very powerful muscles can extend and move their arm very easily, right? It doesn't require much effort. They can lift heavy objects at will, and they can manipulate objects very quickly, very readily, and without much difficulty. So what it means for Venerable Mahamoggallāna to have psychic power means that his mind is like that. He can exert mastery and control and exert force and change the things around him, his environment, through the power of his mind. So just as someone might, for example, use their arms to lift a heavy object, if someone has psychic powers, they might lift a heavy object with the power of their mind, or they might teleport their body with the power of their mind, or they might fly around with the power of their mind, or they might shake, cause things to shake. So, for example, Venerable Mahamoggallāna was famous for shaking a longhouse, like a big house, with his big toe touching the earth, in order to inspire people to practice, to make them realize that life is not as stable as it seems. And so Venerable Mahamoggallāna had psychic powers. He was able to essentially exert very strong meditative mastery, very strong mental power over the world. And so this is something that Venerable Sāriputta himself didn't really have much power over. Venerable Sāriputta was very wise, very able to discern the nature of his mind with his own wisdom and intuitions, and then to teach that and expound it very clearly. So Venerable Sāriputta was famous for his teaching of the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are the core of Buddhism, right? They're the core of the Buddha's teachings. And Venerable Sāriputta was said to be able to, through his teachings, lead disciples to understand the Four Noble Truths. Some of the disciples that Venerable Sāriputta taught, if their faculties were ripe, they could understand the Four Noble Truths through his teaching. And Venerable Mahamoggallāna was then said to take those disciples, the disciples who Sāriputta had led into a deep understanding of the Dhamma, but an initial understanding. Venerable Mahamoggallāna was said to take those disciples and teach them, you could say, all the way up to arahantship, all the way up to complete mastery. And so there you can see a little bit the difference of their faculties, right? So Venerable Sāriputta was able to allow certain people to make deep breakthroughs, very difficult breakthroughs into the Dhamma. Venerable Sāriputta was able to teach people who were ready to attain stream entry. And Venerable Mahamoggallāna was able to take those stream enterers and lead them to arahantship. And the process that Mahamoggallāna was doing then was teaching them how to purify their minds further, right? How to remove defilements, how to power up their minds they were able to they had to develop more samadhi, right? They had to develop stronger meditation and stronger abilities to restrain the mind and to control the mind and to have mastery over the mind. So Venerable Mahamoggallāna was taming further those subtle things, whereas Venerable Sāriputta was able to teach the penetrating wisdom that was needed at the beginning. And so these were very, very famous disciples of the Buddha. Venerable Mahamoggallāna, the foremost of all the Buddha's disciples. The Buddha had many Arahant disciples. Venerable Mahamoggallāna was the foremost of those who had psychic powers. And Venerable Sāriputta was the foremost of those who had wisdom. And so what is the story for these two, right? The Buddha had these very famous chief disciples, but how did they become Buddhist monks? Who were they, right? Who exactly were these people? And this account from the Vinaya in the Buddha's life, which recollects how he came to, as I said, establish an order of monastics. This account tells that story. And so I will go ahead and begin reading. This is from Ajahn Brahmali's translation, Venerable Brahmali, and I can discuss some of the Pali as needed. So this begins. The account of the going forth of Sāriputta and Moggallāna. At that time, the wanderer Santaya was staying at Rajagaha with a large group of 250 wanderers, including Sāriputta and Moggallāna. The two of them had made an agreement that whoever reached freedom from death first would inform the other. Okay, so we can pause here. So you might be wondering, who is the wanderer Santaya, right? And I believe, and as is often spoken about and often discussed, and this is also discussed in the tradition, is that Venerable Sāriputta was a disciple of Sanjaya Belaktiputta. And so here it's written as Santaya with a C instead of a J. But in Pali, these two letters are very, very close to one another. And sometimes they can switch around. Sometimes letters can switch around just due to it being an oral tradition and different pronunciations and so on. So it seems that from all the context and other suttas and the tradition and so on, that what this means is that Venerable Sāriputta and Venerable Moggallāna, this is before they even met the Buddha, they were disciples of Sanjaya Belaktiputta. And you might know him from, for example, the Samanyapala Sutta or other suttas. He was a samana, he was a shramana teacher who was a contemporary with the Buddha, who was teaching what the Buddha called eel wriggling, or flip-flopping, as it's sometimes called. So flip-flopping. And what this means is that he was a kind of skeptic. He was a kind of person who he wouldn't want to insist on any particular thing being true. So, for example, if you asked him, is there life after death? Then he would answer, well, I don't say that there is, but I don't say that there isn't. And I don't deny that there is, and I don't deny that there isn't. And I don't say that it's not this way or that it's not the other way. And he would flip-flop around the different answers. So he would never give you a clear, straight answer. He would always be flip-flopping. So even if you asked him a question, like a spiritual question, he would flip-flop around. He would not insist on one, or he would not settle on one particular thing. And so he was a kind of skeptic, right? Perhaps thinking that by clinging to one doctrine, that would cause him suffering. Or perhaps thinking that it's impossible to know these things, right? Maybe he thought it's impossible to know whether there's life after death. It's impossible to know certain spiritual questions. And by believing that one knows them, then one is deluding oneself and causing suffering and getting agitated in debates and arguments and so on. So perhaps he had this kind of idea that essentially by not clinging on to any views and by believing that it's impossible to settle or find a solution to any spiritual views, he would just flip-flop around the answers and not give a straightforward answer. And it's very funny in the Samanyapala Sutta where King Ajatasattu he's telling his story of how he went and visited different spiritual masters. He went and visited different famous, renowned, well-known spiritual teachers in ancient India. And King Ajatasattu says that when he got to Sanjaya Belaktiputta, when he got to the flip-flopper Sanjaya, and he asked him if there was a benefit of being an ascetic in the present life, is there a benefit of being a monk in the present life, apart from potential future benefits, benefits in the future life? And Venerable Sanjaya just replied with his spiel, his kind of spiel and speech on how he would flip-flop around different spiritual questions. And famously, King Ajatasattu said, this is the most foolish and stupid of all of them. So he thought that, he was not impressed with Venerable Sanjaya because he thought that the other ascetics that the king had asked, they hadn't answered his question directly, but they had at least, said something. But this one he was not impressed with at all because he didn't have anything to say. He just flip-flopped around. Now, of course, we might have some more compassion and say, well, maybe he did have a valid point. Maybe he did have a reason for his thinking and his teaching, as we have just discussed a little bit. But you can see that he was, by some people's standards, he was not particularly impressive. But we see in another sutta that a person named Diganaka, which means long nails, who is believed to be related to Venerable Sāriputta, at one point he tells the Buddha, Sabbame nakkamati, that nothing is acceptable to him. He doesn't agree with anything. And this could be related to Venerable Sanjaya, the wanderer Sanjaya's views, that essentially no views are acceptable, that if you insist on any view whatsoever, if you insist on any truth, or if you even say that any truth is acceptable, if you accept it as, I accept this one and reject that one, then you are committing yourself to suffer. And the Buddha had a discussion with Venerable Diganaka, and he essentially explained to him how to attain awakening and to let go of that view, that even that is a view. Even the view that no view is acceptable, that's a view. Other people would disagree with it. Even the view that nothing can be known for sure, well, that's a view. You're saying you know that, right? To that extent, you're saying you know that nothing can be known for sure, right? Or at least you think that nothing can be known for sure. Or at least you're committing to it to some extent, right? And this is a famous problem with skepticism. So there are particular schools of skepticism, not just Indian skepticism, but also, for example, Greek skepticism, who had a very similar idea. And some of them tried to get around this problem by saying, well, we're not saying that we know that nothing is true, but we're just kind of, they end up kind of falling back on a sort of intuitive sense of like, we just have to kind of, in a way you could say, almost kind of go with the flow and just allow the mind to detach, even from the view of detaching. But from a Buddhist perspective, this really doesn't work. You have to, whatever information you're holding in your mind, whether it's detachment or, no views or no truth or some truth or whatever, the point is not the content of your mind, but the point is how you relate to that. Do you have attachment to it, right? So the problem with views is not necessarily the content of the view, though sometimes that can be a problem. The problem with views is the attaching to that, insisting on it, right? So, for example, maybe someone says, in order to cook rice, you should use this much water and cook it for this long, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And someone else says, no, you should use more water and you should cook it for longer. So who is right? If you don't hold to any views, you might say, no, none of you are right. There's no proper way to cook rice. So, but that's not true, right? If you put rice in cold water and you leave it on the stove for 2 minutes, is it going to cook? No, it will not cook. So, clearly there's a difference between knowing how to cook rice and not knowing how to cook rice. There's a difference. And there are also different ways to cook rice. Some ways you can cook it with, the grains will be harder. Some grains will be softer. Sometimes it'll be more soupy. Sometimes it'll be less soupy. So there are different ways. And not every way is appropriate at all times, right? If someone tells you, I want to cook rice with, some mushrooms on top, and you cook a soupy rice, which is almost water, it's not really going to be working, right? It's not the right type of recipe. And if someone tells you, I'm very sick and I would like to have a rice porridge to ease my digestion, and you cook them very solid, very separate grains of rice with very little liquid and very dry, then that's not going to be very helpful for what they're looking for, right? So there are different ways to cook rice. There are wrong ways and right ways, and then there are different ways within the range of right ways. And this is true of many different things, right? Spiritual things, practical things. So the point is that it's not a problem to understand, what is the right way of rice, what is the wrong way, how are the different ways to be done, and even to correct people when it's necessary. But the problem is if you get angry and you insist, you did it wrong because you should have done this, or I am the best rice cooker of all the world and everyone else is wrong and inferior, right? Or only this culture knows how to cook rice, everyone else is wrong. So that type of attitude, that clinging attitude, which builds an identity, which clings to who you are and clings to who other people are, and gets greedy, gets filled with desire and liking, gets filled with disliking and rejecting, and builds a kind of delusion about the world, that is the problem. The clinging is the problem. So I'm spending time on this so that you have a little bit of background for who these people were, right? Venerable Sāriputta, as well as apparently his relative, and Venerable Mahamoggallāna, they were following, it seems, a teaching like this, a teaching of rejecting all views. But we have to understand that the Buddha's response was, we have to understand the clinging, not just the views themselves. Okay. So let's continue. So now you have a little bit of background, right? Who were these people and who was their leader? So they were following this kind of teaching. And it says that the two of them had made an agreement. So Venerable Sāriputta and Venerable Mahamoggallāna, at this time, he was just Moggallāna, or as we'll see his other name, the two of them made an agreement that whoever had reached freedom from death first would inform the other. The word here is amatang, sometimes called the deathless. The idea is that whoever had realized of these two people, whoever of them realized which was the right path to freedom from death, which was the right path to freedom from suffering, to freedom from the cycle of rebirth. Whoever of them had realized that first, they would tell each other. So they were close, they were friends, right? They were going to share with each other whatever spiritual realizations they had realized so that they could both cross to the other shore. Just then, continuing on, Venerable Assaji robed up in the morning, took his bowl and robe, and entered Rajagaha for alms food. He was pleasing in his conduct, in going out and coming back, in looking ahead and looking aside, in bending and stretching his arms. His eyes were lowered, and he was perfect in deportment. The wanderer Sāriputta observed all this and thought, this monk is one of those in the world, thinking of Venerable Assaji, that he is one who are perfected on the path to perfection. So Venerable Sāriputta thought that Assaji was either an arahant, a perfected one, a worthy one, a fully enlightened one, or someone who is on the path to that. So Venerable Sāriputta thinks, why don't I go up to him and ask in whose name he has gone forth, and who his teacher is, or whose teachings he follows? Right, so he's very inspired. Venerable Sāriputta sees this monk, Assaji, and Assaji is very pleasing in his conduct. He's very mindful. He's very gentle and graceful when he's moving, when he's bending his arms, when he's looking around. He has a kind of grace to him. He has a very calm deportment to him. And Venerable Sāriputta is very inspired by this. And so he thinks, wow, that person there, that must be an arahant or someone who's like an arahant. And Venerable Sāriputta wants to realize the deathless. So he wants to go up and ask this person, who is your teacher? Whose teachings are you following? And for those who don't know, so Venerable Assaji was one of the 5 bhikkhus, one of the 5 ascetics who the Buddha first taught the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. When the Buddha realized enlightenment, and then he went to teach his 5 former companions who had abandoned him, practicing extreme asceticism, the Buddha went back to teach them the Dharma. And Venerable Assaji was one of those 5. Right? Very famous is Venerable Kondanya. Kondanya was famous because he was the first stream enterer that the Buddha had taught. He realized stream entry during the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the teaching of the Four Noble Truths in the Noble Eightfold Path. But Venerable Assaji was another one of those mendicants. He was another one of those 5. And he had also attained arahantship later on, right? Later on, as the Buddha continued instructing the 5 disciples, Venerable Assaji eventually attained arahantship. He eventually became fully enlightened. And so Venerable Assaji is walking through the town. This is one of the Buddha's earliest disciples, one of the most early disciples of the Buddha. And Sāriputta sees him, and he's inspired by him. But it occurred to Venerable Sāriputta, continuing on, it occurred to him, it's the wrong time to ask him while he's walking for alms food among the houses. Let me follow behind him, for one who seeks the path will find it. So see, while Venerable Assaji was going for alms food, his deportment was very inspiring, but it wasn't the right time to ask him questions. So when monastics are on alms round, in the suttas, considered the wrong time to talk to them. They're supposed to be focused on just receiving alms food, on allowing people to make merit and collecting their food for the day. And so it's supposed to be a time of mindfulness and peace and minimal conversation when it's not the right time, especially in a culture where it's understood what's going on. And so he makes this very interesting statement. He says he's going to follow behind him. So he's going to follow him until it's the right time. And he says, for one who seeks the path will find it. So that can be something that we can remember. After walking for alms in Rajagaha, Assaji turned back with his alms food. Sāriputta then went up to him and exchanged pleasantries with him. And he asked, Venerable, your senses are clear and your skin is pure and bright. In whose name have you gone forth? Who is your teacher? Or whose teaching do you follow? And so he's saying, Sāriputta is telling Assaji, your senses are clear and your skin is pure and bright. So this is something often mentioned in the suttas, that when someone is particularly peaceful, maybe they've had a deep meditation, they're very realized, it said that their sense faculties will be very clear, very inspiring, very, you could say, joyful and light. And the skin, the Assaji's complexion, his complexion was very pure looking, very bright, almost radiant. And so that's a sign of someone who is very peaceful, very well practicing, generally speaking, right? And so Venerable Sāriputta is mentioning this to him. You have this serene, bright complexion and faculties. Who is your teacher? Whose teaching do you follow? And Venerable Assaji responds. He says, there's a great ascetic, a Sakyan, who has gone forth from the Sakyan clan. I've gone forth in his name. He is my teacher, and I follow his teaching. So this is referring to the Buddha, of course. The Buddha was said to be a Sakyan. This was a particular clan, a kind of tribe, a sort of minor group of people who had their own system of governance within a larger system. And so the Buddha was a Sakyan, and he had gone forth from the Sakyan family, the Sakyan clan, Sakyan tribe. And Venerable Assaji says that he is a Mahasamana, a great ascetic, a great spiritual renunciant. And he has gone forth in the Bhagavan's name. The Bhagavan is the Buddha. It's a great spiritual teacher, someone who holds the blessings, the wealth of spiritual knowledge, who is complete with their spiritual perfections and then shares that out to other people. So that's who he's saying. He's gone forth under the Buddha, and the Buddha is his great teacher. And Venerable Sāriputta asks, but what does your teacher teach? What is his doctrine? And Assaji says, I've only recently gone forth. I'm new to this spiritual path. I'm not able to give you the teaching in full, but I can tell you the meaning in brief. So he's saying that he can tell him a brief poem. He can tell him a summary of the Dhamma, but he can't really explain it in detail with his own words. And this is very humble of Venerable Assaji, because Venerable Assaji was himself an Arahant, right? And so what he's saying is, he's very new. He had just gone forth. And that's true, right? He had just become a disciple under the Buddha. He hadn't learned the Dhamma explained formally in very much detail. He hadn't learned the details of all the Buddha's explanations very much. So Venerable Assaji had had a deep insight. He had understood the path. He had practiced the path. But he wasn't really very ripe in wisdom, in the sense that he could kind of analyze in his own words all the details of the Dhamma and share that. He could really explain, the essence of what the Buddha had taught him. He could explain the meaning of it in brief, but he couldn't really explicate the details of that. And so he's being very humble, right? He's saying he's very new. He's not laying claim to anything. He's, newly gone forth and he's junior, but he's able to, out of, compassion, he's willing to teach this wanderer, Sāriputta, who will later become the Buddha's chief disciple. He's willing to teach him. And so Sāriputta says, yes, please, please do. Please teach even just a little bit. Venerable Sāriputta wants to hear. Even just a little, he wants to know. And so Sāriputta then replies in a verse. It says, I will say it in Pali just so you can hear. It says, Appang va bahung va bhasasu attang yeva me brohi atteneva me atto kinga hasibyanjanang bahunti. He says, speak little or much, but do tell me the meaning. I just want a teaching, for what's the point of a detailed exposition? So he says, even if it's just a little bit, whether a little bit or a lot, please just tell me the essence, tell me the atta, the meaning, the core. I just want the meaning, for what's the point of detailed phrasing? Excuse me. And so he's saying, a long, detailed exposition, what's the point? He just wants to hear the detail. He wants to hear the essence, I should say. He wants to hear the heartwood of the Buddha's teaching. So he's saying that's enough. And then Venerable Assaji gave this teaching to the wanderer Sāriputta. And this is the core of this teaching. This is the famous exposition, the essence of the Dhamma, right? The very heartwood of the Dhamma, which was enough for Sāriputta. And so Venerable Assaji says in Pali, he says, Ye dhamma hetu pabhava te sung hetung tathagato ah te sanchayo nirodho evang vadi mahasamano. He says, Ye dhamma hetu pabhava, of whatever dharma, of whatever thing, of whatever phenomenon is originated through a condition or a cause. So, of whatever phenomenon is originated through a cause. Te sang hetung tathagato aha, the realized one, the one who has realized the truth, he has declared the cause of that. Te sanchayo nirodho, and also he has declared the cessation of that. Evang vadi mahasamano, that is the teaching of the great ascetic. As Ajahn Brahmali says, of causally arisen things, the Buddha has declared their cause as well as their ending. This is the teaching of the great ascetic. And so this is the essence. This is what Venerable Assaji says. When he heard this teaching, Sāriputta experienced the stainless vision of the truth. He saw that anything that has a beginning has an end. In Pali, the phrase for this is Yang kinchi samudaya dhammang sabbantang nirodha dhammang. Whatever has the nature to arise, all of that, it is said, has the nature to cease. Whatever has a beginning has an end. And then there's a poem here. It says, now this is the truth, even just this much, the starless state that you have penetrated, unseen and neglected for innumerable eons. So someone is supposedly saying this to Venerable Sāriputta, perhaps. It's a poem maybe by the redactors saying that Venerable Sāriputta had penetrated this. And it says, this is the truth, just what he saw. Even just this much. Just that little phrase. We've seen two summaries, that things that arise from a cause, the Buddha has declared the cause and their cessation. That's his teaching. That's the great ascetic's teaching. And Venerable Sāriputta is said to have seen that whatever arises, all of that is bound to cease. And it says, even just this much, it's a sorrowless state. The state, the place free of any sorrow that he has penetrated, that Venerable Sāriputta has seen through. It's been unseen and neglected for innumerable eons. Bahukehi kappanuhutehi. So many expansions and contractions of the universe, right? Many eons, many billions, trillions of years, expanding and contracting for long, long stretches of vast time. This simple statement, right? These simple things that Venerable Sāriputta saw through, it can go neglected, unseen, but he's seen it. Then the wanderer Sāriputta went to the wanderer Moggallāna. Remember, they were friends and they had made a pact. It says, when Moggallāna saw him coming, he said to Sāriputta, your senses are clear and your skin is pure and bright. You haven't attained freedom from death, have you? And Sāriputta says, he has attained it. He has attained freedom from death. He's seen the deathless. And Moggallāna asks him, But how? How did it happen? How did you attain this? How did you attain the deathless? And Sāriputta told him everything, up to and including the teaching given by Assaji. So he told him how he had seen Assaji's calm faculties, how he had seen him wandering very peacefully. And on this, I'll pause because I know this can be very inspiring and very subtle. So I'll pause with something a little bit more lighthearted. But in order to say this, you have to know who are the group of six. So if you've read some of the Vinaya, you'll know that in the Vinaya there is an infamous group of 6 bhikkhus. So these are 6 monks who are famous for being very badly behaved. So they would behave poorly in public and they would do wrong things, and many rules in the Vinaya that things monks are not supposed to do. They're said to have been established because the group of 6 monks was doing naughty things. So they were very naughty monks, right? Very bad monks. Did many bad things, and because of them, it's said that the Buddha had to create many rules, and so they were not well behaved. And so I'll tell you a story. This is a story I've heard. It's about a monk named Upagupta. Upagupta was supposed to be an arahant, a very famous arahant, well known in Thailand and possibly in Sri Lanka, also known in Chinese Buddhism. And during the time of King Ashoka was, in the Buddhist tradition, very revered for being a Buddhist king, for helping spread the Dharma, helping spread the teachings of the Buddha. And in the time of King Ashoka, there was a famous monk named Upagupta. And it's said that Upagupta, at one point in his spiritual journey in ancient India, remember this is about 300 years or so, maybe a little bit less. It would be, I guess in this story, it would actually be less than 300 years. Anyway, so it wasn't that, it could be, I might be mistaking, it might be actually before King Ashoka, shortly before, and kind of during it. But anyway, the point of the story is that Upagupta, he heard that there was only one person alive who had seen the Buddha in person left. So in all of India, there was one person left who had seen the Buddha personally. And he really wanted to know, what was the Buddha like? What was he like in person? And he heard there was one person who had seen him, who was very elderly. It was a bhikkhuni, a senior bhikkhuni. And she was the only person left who had personally seen the Buddha before he passed away. And so Venerable Upagupta heard about her, and she was said to be an arahant, a very attained, powerful bhikkhuni. And so he went and he traveled all that way, wondering what was the Buddha like. And he traveled to find this bhikkhuni and ask her who had seen him. And the bhikkhuni said, I believe with her psychic powers, she saw that Upagupta was coming to ask her, to visit her. And so outside of her kuti, outside of her hut, she got a bowl of oil and she put it on the ground outside of the doorway. And as Upagupta was approaching, he was so excited, so happy to finally be able to ask, what was the Buddha like? And so as he was entering the hut, he wasn't mindful of his stepping, and he knocked over the bowl of oil and spilled it on the floor outside of the hut. But he was in a rush, so he just went into the hut and he bowed, he asked the bhikkhuni, this is my telling of the story, and he asked her, I heard that you're the last person who's seen the Buddha. What was he like? And she tells him that yes, when she was a little girl, when she was very, very young, her parents were offering alms food to the Buddha on his alms round. And as the Buddha was walking by, she was just a little girl with her parents, and her hair clip fell out and fell on the ground, and she couldn't find it. And she said that the Buddha, out of compassion, he helped her find the hairpin. He helped show her where it was so that she could put it back as a little girl. And she said it was so inspiring to see the Buddha. And then later on, she became a bhikkhuni. She became an arahant, and she followed in his footsteps. And she says that in the time of the Buddha, the monks, the disciples of the Buddha, they were so mindful. Their conduct, their deportment was so serene, so peaceful, and so precise that even the group of 6 bhikkhus wouldn't have knocked over and spilled the bowl of oil outside of the door. And so, Upagupta was obviously very ashamed and embarrassed because he was supposed to be, a very renowned monk. and he had knocked over the bowl of oil. And even these horrible, these very naughty monks in the time of the Buddha, she's saying, were very, very mindful. Their deportment was very serene. That was how inspiring the Sangha was in the time of the Buddha. And so you can get, this is what's the point of the story, that Venerable Assaji was very inspiring. And so Venerable Sāriputta tells Mahamoggallāna at this time, just a normal person, just a wanderer, the story. And he tells Mahamoggallāna the same verse. He tells Mahamoggallāna, Ye dhamma hetupabhava, te sanghetung tathagatoaha, te sanchayo nirodho, evangvadi mahasamano. Whatever thing is arisen from a cause, the Tathagata, the one realized the truth, has taught the cause of that, as well as its cessation. This is the doctrine of the great ascetic. And Venerable Moggallāna saw that anything which has a beginning, whatever is of the nature of arising, all of that is bound to cease. And then there's a verse for him. Now this truth, the truth that he saw, even just that much, the sorrowless state that you have penetrated, that Venerable Mahamoggallāna saw, unseen and neglected for innumerable eons. Moggallāna said to Sāriputta, let's go to the Buddha. He's our teacher, he says. But these 250 wanderers look to us for support. We must tell them first, so that they may take appropriate action. So remember, they were disciples of Sanjya. There's a lot of them. And so now they're going to leave. They're going to go to a new teacher. They both became stream enterers. And so they went to the wanderers and said, we're going over to the Buddha. He's our teacher, they say. And they say, but we look to you for support. If you are to practice the spiritual life under the great ascetic, so will all of us. And so all 250 disciples, because Venerable Mahamoggallāna and Sāriputta were maybe the leaders of this community, they all converted to Buddhism. They all went to go find the Buddha. And so Sāriputta and Moggallāna went to Sanchya and said, we're going over to the Buddha. He's our teacher. And Sanchya says, don't go. The three of us can look after this community together. Sāriputta and Moggallāna said the same thing a second time and a third time, and they got the same reply. Please don't go. So Sanjay is offering them, all three of them can be the leaders. Then they took those 250 wanderers, the disciples of Sanjay, and they went to the bamboo grove where the Buddha was. And it says, but the wanderer Sanjay vomited hot blood right there. So he was very upset by this. When the Buddha saw Sāriputta and Moggallāna coming, he said to the monks, the two friends, Kolita and Upatissa, are coming. They will become my most eminent disciples, an excellent pair. Kolita is Mahamoggallāna's name, his personal name. Moggallāna is his last name, his clan name. And Upatissa is Sāriputta's name. So Kolita and Upatissa are the names of Moggallāna and Sāriputta. And then there's a poem. They had not even reached the bamboo grove, yet had a profound range of knowledge about the supreme end of ownership, about freedom. And the teacher said of them, these two friends are coming, Kolita and Upatissa. They will be an excellent pair. The Buddha, he says, they will be the Buddha's, my most eminent disciples, the Buddha's most eminent disciples. Ete dve sahayaka agachanti kolito upatissocha etame savaka yugam bhavisyati aggang bhadda yuganti. That's what the Buddha says. Sāriputta and Moggallāna approached the Buddha, bowed down with their heads at his feet, there's the doorbell, and said, Sir, we wish to receive the going forth in your presence. We wish to receive the full ordination. The Buddha said, come, monks. The teaching is well proclaimed. Practice the spiritual life to make a complete end of suffering. That was the full ordination of those venerables. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And so that is how Venerable Sāriputta and Venerable Mahamoggallāna, Kolita and Upatissa came to be monks. Right? Sāriputta first attained stream entry with the very short summary from Assaji, Venerable Assaji. Then he went and told Moggallāna as they had promised, and they both converted all the people. And as the Buddha saw them coming, he realized those are going to be two great disciples. Even before they even met the Buddha, they already had attained a knowledge of the Dhamma. And the Buddha says, come. That's their full ordination. He says, Etta bhikkhu, come, monks. He says, Svakato Dhammo. He says, the Dhamma has been well proclaimed. Charata brahmacharyang. Live, wander, live the spiritual life. Samma dukkhassa antakiriyaya. To make a complete end of all dukkha. To make a rightful, complete end of dukkha. So that's what the Buddha's instruction to them. He says, come, the Dhamma has been well taught. Practice the spiritual life to make an end of dukkha. And then they became two bhikkhus. They became two monks. practicing, converted to Buddhism, you could say. And from then on, they will go on to become very, very famous for many generations to come. And so I know usually what's talked about most often is this verse teaching the Dhamma, ye Dhamma hetupabhava, etc., that whatever thing is originated from a cause, and the cessation that the Buddha has taught those things. So that's the most famous, right? That's the essence of this teaching, the Dhamma content. And you see, this is really at the heart of the Buddha's teaching, as it says, right? What are the Four Noble Truths, friends? Dukkha, its arising. The Buddha teaches its ceasing, and the path to its ceasing. So he teaches whatever is arisen from a cause. He teaches the cause, the cessation of the cause, and of course, how to arrive at that cessation. And so the Four Noble Truths, this 4-line verse, the short summary that whatever has a beginning is whatever arisen, all that when someone realizes it, they realize that what they've seen is bound to cease. Those things are summaries of the same essence of the Buddha's teaching. And what that's talking about, is that they realize that their whole, you could say they're understanding the Four Noble Truths, right? That their whole life, their whole existence in samsara, everything, even what seems to have been there since time immemorial, even what seems the most constant, enduring, the most basis of everything, right? All of that, they see that all of that will have to cease. All of it is bound to come to an end because of their realization. And so it's a very profound teaching, very subtle, very simple, but very subtle, very profound. And so I encourage you, I really encourage all of you to re-examine, go over the Four Noble Truths, but penetrate them, bring them into your heart. Really don't just look at the surface, right? Venerable Sāriputta, remember what he says. He just wants to hear the essence, the core, right? The meaning of it all. So really try to bring those in. That's enough. Just that is enough. Just that little bit is enough. And so when we meditate, when we follow precepts, when we practice generosity, don't just do it blindly. Don't just do it to make merit. Don't just do it for those things. Those are good things, right? But do it in order to understand the Four Noble Truths. Do it to see that everything has an end. Everything that's arisen, all of it is bound to cease. Do it to realize those things. Okay, friends, so this time we can close with 3 sadhus. And if you have any questions about this, we can go ahead and look at those. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I see a question from Richard. Richard says, Bhante, I reflect on paticca samuppada and the fading of tanha, yet a subtle sense of asmimana remains. How can I deepen insight and let go of this final conceit in daily life? This is Richard's quote. Well, Richard, I would say so in the story that I told of Venerable Sāriputta and Mahamoggallāna and how they taught the Buddha's disciples, so what's necessary when you reflect on the Dhamma and when you are relating to the Dhamma, then you have to then purify it further, right? You have to then extend those same principles further, deepen them further. So the Buddha is one time discussing, I think even maybe Venerable Sāriputta is actually answering a question. Someone says, how does someone attain stream entry? And Venerable Sāriputta says that they should practice, by reflecting on the aggregates as impermanent and on self, essentially, basically that they should practice the Noble Eightfold Path, right? And then how do they attain once returning? The same exact thing. How do they attain non-returning? The same exact thing. How do they attain arahantship? The same exact thing. So it's the same exact practice, but you just have to deepen, right? You have to deepen over and over again, whether you're starting from the very beginning or you're going through the practice. We should always be returning to the very basis of everything, right? We should be returning to what is the Buddha teaching as the basis, right? So we should be trying to clarify our view. We should be trying to clarify our intentions and our thoughts, clarify our speech and our actions, clarify our livelihood, clarify our right effort, make sure to purify over and over again deeper and more subtle levels of greed, hatred, delusion, laziness, negligence, attachment, self-identifying, and so on. Practicing deepening, we need to really encourage ourselves to practice more mindfulness, more steady mindfulness, more consistent mindfulness, more clear mindfulness, more pure mindfulness. And we need to develop samadhi. We need to, if we haven't yet, we have to attain samadhi. And and you need to then, once you attain it, then you need to, so if we haven't attained samadhi, we need to attain it. And if you do attain samadhi, then you need to develop it, right? So it's the same exact practice, whether we're starting at the very beginning or wherever someone is on the path. So it says, it seems like all of these accounts of breakthrough seem to talk about cause and cessation or impermanence of conditioned phenomena. Even Dipa Ma had similar experiences of remembering Buddha saying the same thing. But we hear this every day when we read the Dhamma. Are their accounts different in the sense that they're actually seeing arising and cessation rather than just hearing it? What makes them see it? And no matter how many times we hear, we don't see it as just the regular ordinary people. Well, so do you say, are they seeing rather than just hearing it? Yes, that is 100% the case, right? So it's important, they're not just hearing the words on the surface intellectually and then assenting to them, right? Agreeing to them because they sound nice. So the Buddha says that when listening to the Dhamma, if one has a mind completely enveloped on the theme, so not fault-finding, not thinking about, distracted thoughts, not kind of weaseling around, but just completely focusing on the meaning in order to absorb it fully into the heart, listening with the heart and not just the ears, right? But fully absorbed, wanting to understand, bringing it and reflecting it on your own experience spontaneously. So remember, Venerable Sāriputta, he was so eager to hear, right? He was very, very focused, very inspired. He had faith, he had focus, he had attention, he had a clear heart, right? And he was really, really driven. He wanted to know. So he wasn't just kind of casually listening around, right? He was really, really engaged in listening. And then with that engagement, if you develop the 7 awakening factors, which really they have to come spontaneously in that kind of context. So mindfulness, so very, very focused, recollecting what's being heard, bringing it in, holding it in the mind, investigating it, almost on, it needs to be on a subverbal level almost, right? It might start with the verbal, right? They're hearing the words, but they need to investigate subverbally. And then they develop joy and faith in their mind, they allow their mind to absorb that message and penetrate into a more intuitive level. So if you've ever had a eureka moment, right, you might have had one just in a mundane level, right? And it's not something you can force. So what is wisdom? What is intuition? What is insight? What it is when the mind, on any level, any mundane level even, it's when the mind makes subtle connections which are below the surface, but then it bears fruit on the surface of the mind. So like maybe you're thinking about a situation, you have all the data, you know all the things, but you just can't figure out what to do. And all of a sudden your mind makes a connection beneath the surface level, and it ties together all that information and draws out something new from it. So someone with very ripe faculties, someone who has a lot of wisdom, right? Remember, Venerable Sāriputta had a lot of wisdom. Wisdom is the ability, one of the manifestations of wisdom is with a limited set of information, the mind is able to extract from that something deeper on a subverbal level, on an intuitive level. So that's what makes, for example, the Buddha very special. The Buddha is able to experience reality. The same data that all of us have. We all live life. We all experience samsara, right? But the Buddha is able to clarify his experience of it and experience it at a deep level that his mind is able to have an intuitive insight and extract that. But not only that, see what makes the Buddha special is he's able to do it without being pointed the way from other instructions. And once he has the insight, he's able to explain it and point the way to others. Right? What about a Pacceka Buddha, an independent Buddha? That's someone who is able to see something. Maybe they see impermanence, they see death, or they see things fading, or they meditate on the nature of their mind, but they don't have pointing the way instructions, but they realize their mind has an insight. It breaks through and it understands from that set of data. They understand, the nature of reality, but they're not able to then draw out that subconscious, that subverbal insight in the mind. They experience it. They can kind of point to it like, don't you see things are impermanent? But they can't point the way enough. They can't draw out the implications enough that other people can then penetrate the insight. So insight, it's not just the information. It's the ability to have deep insight into the information to draw out a deeper principle. And so someone has to be able to be a Buddha. They have to be able to have that without instructions and then develop instructions. A solitary Buddha, an independent Buddha, they have it without instructions, but it's too subtle. They can't actually draw out what exactly happened. So they know what they saw, but they can't exactly draw out, how to explain it. And an Arahant is someone who they have the help of the Buddha's instructions. So they can point it out with the help of the Buddha's instructions. So it's kind of that. So you have to just allow your mind to develop, you have to purify your mind, clarify your mind with a Noble Eightfold Path, and reflect on your own experience, the meaning of the words deeply, so that you can see in your own experience and then allow your mind to draw those deep insights. So it has to be spontaneous, but you build the conditions, right? You build the conditions by purifying the mind. And sometimes, in the case of Venerable Sāriputta here, his mind was very purified from deep faith, spiritual urgency, and focus when he was listening, as well as his faculties being very ripe, right? He had a lot of wisdom anyway. So, but it's not impossible for you also to experience that. So just, you might not be at the level of, Sāriputta, right? He had a lot of ripe faculties. But with more teachings, right? He had that little teaching that was enough for him, as well as Moggallāna. But with more teachings and reflecting and purifying your mind, you can also realize that. It's also important not to cut corners. So, it's not like, the breath arises and ceases. No, remember, it's everything in your experience. Whatever has arisen. So anything you experience, that means it's arisen. If you're experiencing it, it's arisen. All of that. Including your sense, the sense of self being stable. All of that is arisen. Okay. We don't have much time, but let's continue. Hasanta says, these epiphany stories are inspiring, but I wonder if there is some mental telepathy communication as well as just the words. I would say, of course, we can't say for sure, but I would say, no, that, for example, remember that the Buddha wasn't teaching this, right? Remember that Assaji was the teacher, who was, he was an Arahant, and he wasn't even, very long gone forth. He hadn't even heard that many teachings to be able to explain in detail in his own words, right? So, the Buddha wasn't even there, and it's never mentioned. So, what is the story? The point is that the Dhamma, when the conditions are ripe, the essence of the Dhamma is arising and ceasing, and conditional arising and ceasing, right? Dependent origination. The Buddha is famous for, after his awakening, declaring 3 verses or it's actually poems, I should say, that are declared about his awakening, that conditions, their arising and their ceasing, become apparent to the meditating ardent Brahmin. So it's really the appearance of conditions clearly manifesting to their minds through the pointing instructions of the Dhamma. It's no different from the people. So whether it's an image or it's words, none of that is sufficient, right? So images also wouldn't be sufficient just in and of themselves. It requires that someone have insight into the meaning of those in their experience. And Julie says, watching the Dhamma talk later, so sadhu, Julie. Okay, and then Richard asks, reflecting on the deep commitment of Sāriputta and Moggallāna to the Dhamma, even after practicing under Sangha and being respected teachers themselves, how can we as lay practitioners, he says, cultivate that same humility and resolve when letting go of cherished views or identities that no longer serve the path? Well, the most important thing is use your wisdom, use your practice. When you find that you have these attachments, understand them as unwholesome, as obstacles. Understand them that as much as we might feel special, or as much as we might want to cling on to what we know or what we've learned or what we've practiced, that is an obstacle to freedom. That's an obstacle, and it will create more suffering for ourselves and others. We're causing a lot of suffering just by being here, and so by attaching with our identity and so on. And so we have to reflect, like, no matter what, it's not worth it. So just by knowing it's a problem and by having these examples, with that over time, just keep practicing, and that's enough. You don't have to really force it. You can't force, like, you're letting go. It has to come with when the conditions are ripe. And so what's important is that you know it's unwholesome, that you practice to recognize it, and you practice to purify your mind and move to more subtle things. And then naturally that will happen. So you have to allow it. What's important is you just don't forget. But the danger is if you think that something is not to be let go of. If you cling to it, meaning like you just trust it, you think, that you have the truth, or that you know enough. That's the problem. Then you won't be able to let go. But if you know that it's something to be let go of, then you can do it. And we will have to go, but I will just say one more comment briefly. So it says, how does developing the Noble Eightfold Path play into these spontaneous realizations? Well, so I would say briefly, it's like, for example, the Buddha likens it to when you have a pool of water, which is very clear. Someone can see very clearly what's in the water. So by purifying your mind, by stabilizing your mind, by developing sila to train your mind on a coarse level, and then developing samadhi, you train your mind on a more subtle level, and then you use that to develop wisdom to see clearly. The point is that by developing purification of mind, by clarity, by pointing your mind in the right direction and purifying your mind, you're going to be able to see more clearly what's going on. But when our mind is obscured by desire, we see what we want to see. We focus on what we want to focus. We don't see what we should see. And so we focus in the wrong ways and so on. And so that's why purifying the mind is very important. Okay, friends. So thank you for listening, and thank you for your practice. At this time, we can close, and I hope that you have a beautiful morning and a beautiful time whenever you're watching this video. May you be well, happy, peaceful. May all good things come to you.